Hey, greetings, Fred in Alaska. Thanks for joining me. What I wanted to share with you today comes from Alexander and Carol. Alexander and Carol met in college back in the 70s. He was in college to be a geologist. And one of his, in his third year, some people had spoken to him about the Kenai Peninsula, and there's, beautiful fjords coming out of the water and all this. And he had been in Anchorage the whole time, between Anchorage and Fairbanks. One year he spent in Fairbanks and the other two in Anchorage, but he never had a chance to actually go down to the peninsula because he's from out of state. And so, for one of his summer trips, mid-70s, he reached out to some people, looked at some maps, and ended up wanting to go to Wolverine Creek. And he said he wanted to go there because he liked the sound of the name. Now, if you Google Earth Wolverine Creek, it's up the Nellie Jean or Nellie Wan River, which comes off of, I believe it's Kings Bay or something like that down there. It's very, very remote, fjord-like everywhere. So he gets himself together a small grub stake, him and Carol. They had 2 dogs, and they coordinated with some people, through some people and friends down on the peninsula, and made it happen. Had a fishing boat they chartered to get them in there, get them dropped off. They were dropped off with a week's worth of provisions, and their plan was to base camp near the bay, offshore a ways, because the weather changes in there so much, and then they would hike back however many miles to Wolverine Creek and check the rocks and all that along the way, which, hey, beautiful area. I mean, just to go. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, and to learn from it as well, it was like a win-win. So he had a shotgun, had a handgun. Carol was armed as well. They did not go naive as far as bears. There's very large bears in Alaska. It is what it is. So they got the moose warnings and all that from the locals, because moose will stomp you to death. They, in my opinion, are more dangerous than a brown bear in the wild. The brown bear in the wild will run off. You can scare a bear away with a warning shot a lot of times. A moose will just look at you with a warning shot and be like, anyway. So they're there, and they had planned a week-long excursion, look around, spend some time together. And their 2 dogs were both of a collie variety. One was half lab, half collie, and the other was full collie of some kind. So the first 2 days they spent weathered in because it was raining and blowing really hard, and they just really weren't that motivated to schlep it up the river, because there's smaller feeder creeks that feed into it. And so what they ended up having to do once they made it out on the 3rd day is kind of wade through water with the hip waders to the gravel bar, and then kind of do the zigzag motion just to clear the deeper channels to make it up there, because it's so remote and so dense. So they're dealing with, poplar, willows, alders, some black spruce, some birch, a little mix of everything as far as the plant life down at the base of these steep mountains. Because if you look at a topographical, that area, every line on there jumps up 1,000 feet. So they're literally going into a V-shaped valley, right? So he wasn't the best map reader and compass follower, but they figured with the river will lead them right back to where their camp is. So they had a guaranteed go down river, we'll get back to camp kind of thing, so they don't get lost. So according to what he was explaining, now he has since retired from his profession. A friend of his turned him onto this channel just because he had mentioned this to his friend in the past, and his friend happened to be a viewer of this channel. So he wanted to make it clear to me that before this happened, he knew nothing about any folklore, mythology coming from Alaska, hairy man, little people, none of this. It was all college, between there and here, and all that. It was all the scientific type thing. And he gave not a second thought to the Patterson-Gimlin footage or any of that stuff. So, and you know, those who don't know, they don't know. I mean, fair enough. So, oh, I apologize. Hold on one second. My apologies. I thought I had my ringer off. So, you know, he was totally scientific and knew nothing, but he was more worried about bears and stuff, right? So, him and Carol, they got up to a point, not all the way up to Wolverine Creek, because it just got so treacherous. There was different shaped boulders and rocks, and he wasn't outdoorsy enough to have the confidence to go any further. So what they did is they stopped, made a little spike camp to make lunch, you know, start a little fire to heat up some stuff. And as Carol was doing that, they had stopped along the riverbank where there was an old tree stump, not a very big one, but one that just blocked the wind enough to where they could have that little fire behind that as a windbreak, and she could tend to the food or whatever. So what he said was she was cooking up some beans and had this little pot. Now this is middle of the day, okay? Summertime in Alaska, so the sun is very high, very bright. He said the sun was almost directly above them, so there wasn't like it was just gonna go over the mountainside or whatever and they, you know, be in the dark or in the dusk or whatever. So it's the middle of the day. Now they were yelling back and forth because there was a breeze going through there, and she's tending to the beans, and she had slid them off into a group of rocks, and she had that group of like 3 rocks set up for the beans to sit on to cool off, right? Now you got a picture that they're off a little sandbar. Their Carol's back is to the riverside, and with this little tree stump, little campfire, and 3 rocks holding this pot of beans, right? So Carol commences to follow after Alex to let him know, hey, the beans are done. As she literally, according to what was told to me, she literally wasn't paying attention to behind her because it was just the rush of the river sound, right? So she commences to walking up a little ways to find Alex. He was looking at some rocks and whatnot, right? Just doing the geologist thing, just, you know, just looking at different species of rock or whatever. So she walks towards him. He was approximately 50 yards away to let him know lunch was ready. You know, lunch is done, because that they were stopping there. They were going to mill around and then head back to camp and slowly explore the place, right? So when he gets up to, or when she gets up to him to get his attention, he's pointing out rocks and this and that to her, and she wasn't really all that interested, but, you know, played along with him because it was his thing. This comes from both of them. So Alexander goes, well, let's go eat. He realized he was boring Carol with this, right? So they're getting ready to head back down. Just there's a little bit of brush kind of blocking and obscuring the view, but they heard the bean pot clank over. So she thought, oh, the wind must have caught it just right. And she goes, come on, I don't want the beans to spill. So they come trotting out of the trail. When they come off this little game trail, they're pointing directly at the fire in front of them, the little tree stump behind that, and the river behind that. Now, once they get to that point, they see this figure behind the tree stump with a stick. This thing had a stick and was had poked it into the beans, and when they came out of the trail, it was smelling the end of the stick. And Carol immediately fell to the ground in shock, and Alexander had the 12 gauge slung over him and had a handgun on his hip. But when they came out and they were confronted with this image of this thing standing there smelling a stick, it looked at them, they looked at it, it dropped the stick and leapt across the little channel there and booked straight across away from them and hit the tree line and started cutting up the side of the other side of the mountain. Now, he said that they were in such shock about it, they didn't recognize it as a hairy man. They thought it was some guy in a weird fur coat, because they said the face looked human, big jaw, but it had almost like a beard-like look to it. It was like a auburnish, cinnamon type red, and they were basically in shock. He thought nothing about pulling a firearm, none of that. He said, however, he noticed it was not a bear, because Carol got down because she thought Alexander was going to shoot this bear, because her initial thought was not, she couldn't put it together that it was not a bear. So she dropped down to clear way, because they had prearranged, if we come across a bear in front of you, you drop to the ground and I will take care of the firing of the gun if need be. So she went by protocol that they prearranged. Boom, she drops down, and he did nothing. So they exchanged notes at the campsite, at their little spike camp. They immediately start putting out the fire. He asked Carol, what did you see? I didn't see a bear. I saw a hand go up when it dropped the stick. She goes, I dropped down and covered up. I was trying to plug my ears because I thought the shotgun was going to shoot. So this happens. They don't know what the hell to do, because he didn't view it as a hairy man. He viewed it as some weirdo in the remote wilds of Alaska, potentially with a fur coat on, attempting to steal their food. He thought it was a hungry person initially. So they discuss what's going on. Carol says, let's leave the beans. They pushed gravel over the fire. They left the pot of beans, and it was one of those little camper pots. They said they had 3 or 4 of them for the trip. So they just left it there and commenced back to their main camp. Now, this whole time they were walking, Alexander's head on a swivel. He's looking around, and he's backtracking. He's justifying what he saw in his mind. How did a man move that quickly across that river? He's doing the math. That he was like, that channel is at least 12 foot wide. I don't know a man that can just easily leap that far with one bound and tear off through the trees that fast. So as they're going along, and they can't rationalize everything because none of it is really making sense, they get back to camp, and Alexander tells Carol, we shouldn't be here. We should probably move. And Carol's like, well, we shouldn't run away. I didn't see him carrying a gun. I didn't see no guns. Did you see any guns? And they're like, because they're still worried about a weirdo in the woods, you know, stealing their food kind of thing. So he was like, I saw nothing but a fur coat. Like, because it happened so fast, they didn't get a full-on look. He just knew it looked human. He said the color of the skin was like a real rugged, leathery look, you know, real weathered face. So it wasn't like an ash gray or a charcoal gray like some of the reports. So human looking, ran off, assumed it was a fur coat type of shit. So they decide they're gonna camp where they're at, and what Alexander does is has Carol help him get some of the driftwood from the bay there and kind of put up a quasi fence around a group of trees that were to basically give a backstop to their tent, so nothing can just come from the backside of their tent while they're sleeping. So they got all that arranged. They still have a handful of hours before it gets dark, so they have time to sit there and contemplate the day's events, right? So, you know, they're discussing, well, if it was some crazy loon, maybe we should holler out and ask if he needs help. Maybe this person is missing, saw us, didn't know what to do, you know, whatever. So they go to the humanitarian route. Okay, well, we have a handful of hours before it gets dark. Let's go back up a little ways and start hollering to see if we can get him coaxed out and get him some help, right? So now they're on a rescue in their mind. So they, of course, bring guns, and they bring some snack stuff in case this person is hungry. They bring in extra blanket and some other stuff to offer this person, right? So they're basically, in their mind, they're going to make offerings to bring this person out of the wild and get him some help. Now, the whole time they're going along, they both feel uneasy because certain things didn't add up. How fast it moved, how far it jumped, its size. Because up until later on during this thing, they didn't take account for its size. They just saw something what they thought was a person behind the stump pushing the beans with the stick. That's what they were working with outside of the running away. So as they're going along, they get to a certain point where they had to cross a shallower portion of the channel to get up onto this sandbar, and so, or this gravel bar. So they're on this gravel bar, and they start hollering out in the direction, because he said they were probably at least a half mile from where they were initially, but they figured from this point there should echo off the walls of the mountains and what have you up this valley. So they start yelling, "Hey, we're here to help, we're here to help." And it was dead quiet. The wind had died down at that point, dead quiet. They were getting nothing back, but they started hearing a very sharp whistle, very sharp, crisp whistle coming from somewhere in front of them. It wasn't up on the mountainside, because there was no trees to be had at any high level. And so the whistles are coming from somewhere in this valley in front of them. Again, they holler out, "Hey," and so Alexander whistles. He whistles really loud and tries to imitate it as sharp and crisp as possible. Nothing comes back. A few moments later, they're like, "Well, what do we do?" No one's responding. They hear that sharp whistle again coming from somewhere a little closer now up this valley, and they immediately, Alexander said that he didn't feel right. We should go. We should just go. We shouldn't be here, is the feeling he felt internally. So he didn't want to get Carol riled up. Now, this whole time, their two dogs, they left tied up at camp because they didn't want the dogs potentially scaring a bear and bringing that bear right back to them, right? So here's where the whole having the dogs things comes into play. They get back to camp, and the whole while they're heading back to camp, periodically behind them they hear that sharp, crisp whistle. Now, it's eerie at this point. Why is this? They assumed it was this person making this whistle and following us. So Alexander's like, "We need to change our trail back. We need to change our back trail and kind of backtrack, and let's cut across a few of these gravel bars and kind of go through the water a few times and kind of obscure our trail back." So they do that. Meanwhile, this whistling continues periodically from behind them, out of view. They get back to camp, and Alexander's like, "Well, I'm gonna let the dogs loose. I'm gonna let them loose so they can roam around, maybe, you know, be an early warning system." So they let the dogs go. The dogs tear off up the trail they went on, and Alexander immediately goes, "Oh crap, they're gonna bring a bear back, right?" And so he's calling for his dogs, No response. They were gone. Beelined up the trail. So immediately Carol's concerned about the welfare of the dogs. Now, they're sitting at camp. They're not going to catch the dogs. They know this. So, you know, they're smart enough to go, they will come back. So they go and sit down at camp, and they're contemplating this whistle. They're discussing, and Carol tells Alexander, "I don't feel good. I feel sick to my stomach. That whistle, I've never heard that whistle." Alexander, you know, understands, because he ain't never heard a whistle like that either. So he said about an hour passed as they were continuing to discuss the day's events, right? This is only their third day. Again, the first couple days they were reined in, you know, they weren't gonna go out in that crap. So with that, sitting there, here comes one of the dogs, the lab mix, comes running back, panting like all hell. Tried to go and hide somewhere by this makeshift fence they made behind their tent, right? So the one dog's hiding, the other one's still MIA. Now they're sitting there. Alexander's concerned. He goes, "I'm gonna go up the trail a little ways and look for the other dog." And so Carol agrees, but you know, he brings a shotgun and he's going up the trail, and as he's doing so, he hears rustling in the brush and gets very, very nervous. So he's on point with the shotgun, safety's off, you know, finger hovering on the trigger, ready for anything, when the other dog comes barreling out of the brush, past him like he didn't exist, and kept going. Right after that happened, another sharp whistle, but it sounded like it was around him, he said. Turned around immediately and followed suit with the dog, ran back to camp. He said as he was running back to camp, he heard movement in the brush, but it wasn't like a thunderous something huge busting through the brush. He just heard some snapping of twigs and some stepping on vegetation, nothing overly alarming other than a strange sound coming from off behind his left-hand side. He gets back to camp, and when he gets back to camp, Carol's standing there armed. She has the rifle in her hand, and she's basically on point, because she heard him coming back and didn't know if it was him or not. With the events, she was ready with the gun. So she was relieved to see Alexander come out. The other dogs with the other dog back behind the tent by these logs that they had made makeshift fence, right? So immediately Carol's like, we shouldn't be here. We should leave. We should leave. And Alexander's like, we are here for another few days until they come back to get us. There was no sat phones, there was nothing like that. They had a flare gun, but there's no way where they were anyone was going to see any flare unless there happened to be a boat right out in the bay, and there was no other traffic. Every once in a while a bush plane would fly by, you know, but nowhere near them. So Alexander calms her down and says, we don't know what's going on. This guy may just be a loony that's out in the woods. Let's just, you know, just calm down and let's take it easy. So Carol retreats into the tent, upset, and Alexander is basically making sure they have firewood for the brief few hours of darkness that they knew was ahead of them. Now, he went, after he got the firewood and stuff ready, still with the shotgun, he goes over and checks on the dogs because they hadn't moved since they went and scurried and hid. And so he went and checked on them. They appeared to be okay, but typically he had a ball for the lab mix one that wouldn't stop chasing this ball, but this dog had no interest in the ball, listening to what he had to say or any of that encouragement. So he checked him, didn't see any injuries, no broken bones or anything, so he let him be to calm down and goes back over to continue tending to this firewood pile, right? Because of the rain, certain stuff was wet, so he was kind of laying stuff near the fire they had going to kind of dry it out before they used it. Common method. So as he's doing that, he's realizing I'm probably going to need more firewood, so he has a handsaw, and there are some other tree stumps further down the beach. He lets Carol know, I'm going to go cut some of these roots off of these, you know, root balls off of this, you know, these fallen trees for dry wood. She's all for it. She understands. She comes out, sits by the little fire, and stays on point with the gun. He goes and does this thing. As he's doing it, he's got an armload of wood. He can't hold a gun and have an armload of wood. So he's got his armload, shotgun slung, and walking along back up the beach, going to where their camp is. Now, remember, this is their camp is actually offset of the beach, so he has to go up and then cut up this little bank to get back over to their camp. Now, as he gets to the bank, he puts the wood up top, climbs up, and he's picking it up. As he's doing so, he hears a gunshot. Immediately drops what he's doing, unslings the shotgun, and he beelines it for camp, yelling, "Carol, Carol, Carol." Well, when he gets there, Carol is down on one knee, and she has the rifle, and she's shaking. She's pointing towards a group of bushes that is about 25 yards away. Alder willows. It was thick tangle of brush, right? So Alexander's like, "What'd you shoot? What'd you shoot?" She goes, "Whatever it was big and dark. I didn't shoot it. I shot up in the air." He goes, "Well, where was it?" She pointed it out, so he goes, "I'm gonna go take a look." She's like, "Don't do it, don't do it." He goes, "What did you see?" She said, "It was back." And he goes, "Well, what we saw?" And she goes, "Yes, it's huge. It is huge." And he goes, "Well, how do you know it's huge? You know, what's your reference here?" The bushes that she saw it stand up in behind, they walked by earlier that day, and the bushes and brush towered over them, and that was her reference. She didn't have an exact measurement. She just knew whatever this was much larger than them, and it freaked her out because she didn't notice it while he was gone getting the wood. According to her, she was sitting there just kind of poking around at the fire and just kind of reminiscing about whatever. and noticed this thing watching her from the brush. Freaked out, shot in the air, thing disappeared. There was some ruffling around, gone. So he goes, takes a look, and he saw some tracks, but they were obscured because it looked like it turned the trek and ran, so he couldn't really fully make it out. But they were big tracks, and he was very concerned. So he gets back over to Carol and says, we should probably move our camp. They didn't have any good options to move this camp. They were where they needed to be picked up. They thought of it and said, we'll hold steady here and just make do for the next few days till our ride comes back. Now, as they're discussing this, he hears movement back behind him from the direction he was just checking out the tracks and stuff. What they saw was something dark moving around behind that brush. So what he did was let the shotgun go. Ba-boom! Not at it, but over in that direction. Went dead silent. Heard a whistle immediately after the gunshot. He said the whistle they heard immediately after the gunshot was so loud, it was piercing to the ear. Now, he also stated that once that whistle was done, there was some thrashing, but it was opposite side of this river, and it was such a ruckus that they heard it over the rushing sounds of the river there, and the little bit of wind that had kicked up ruffling the leaves and shit, right? So whatever it was big and made a lot of noise across the way. Immediately they are freaked out. They didn't know what to do. They both retreated back into the tent. They dragged the dogs inside, and they sat there. And it's still light out. It hadn't even gone into dusk yet. They still probably had about another hour of daylight left, right? So he began just reading out loud from one of his books from college. He's just talking about whatever. He just opened and started randomly reading, just trying to change the subject because they were both really, really freaking out hard. Now, nothing overtly dangerous has happened yet. I mean, nothing at all. The dogs ran off. The dogs came back. They saw something. They heard whistles. I mean, in the big scheme of things, there was nothing like, it wasn't like, I'm gonna get you. It was there was this ominence in the air, this presence that was very uneasy. He kept reading from the book for a while, and it started getting darker, and he was hearing stuff outside, but at a little bit of a distance. And he said as soon as he heard something closer, he said, I'm enough of this. I'm gonna make a stand. He jumps out. He's got the shotgun. He comes around the little fence thing to the direction of that noise. When he said when he came around, he saw something dark. He shot in the air, and as he pulled the trigger, he noticed it was a black bear. And the black bear, gone, just tore off through the brush. He was like, oh, a regular animal, right? So he almost shot the bear, but you know, because he decided to shoot up in the air in that brief split second, he was able to notice it was just a black bear, and it tore out of there. So retreated back inside, said it was just a black bear. Maybe we're overreacting to everything. Maybe it's just a verifiable reason what's going on here. Maybe it's wildlife we're unfamiliar with. Sat there reading some more. Carol calmed down. They decided to go back out by the fire, make some coffee. They didn't plan on sleeping that night. As they sat there and it got into dusk, they heard that whistling, but it was coming from way up from them, way far away, so they were relieved that this noise wasn't close. They sat there for a couple hours, got into dark. They stoked the fire up nice, and they were sitting with their back against some logs they had leaned up that faced the bay. So their back is to the bay, basically in the drop bank before it goes down to the beach, and in front of them is their fire, just off to their left a little bit, and that valley running up back towards Wolverine Creek. They sat there and just were watching, listening, talking, very nervous. Now, nothing happens at night, no more noises. They end up waking each other up, like, because they fell asleep sitting out there. still some embers going, so they restoked the fire. They decided, okay, nothing happened, we obviously fell asleep and nothing attacked us, so let's go to bed in the tent. So they go and curl up in the tent. The dogs this whole time did not come back out of the tent. They stayed in there. They slept most of the way through the next day because they were so exhausted, and nothing detrimental happened. And nothing detrimental happened, so they were like, okay, whatever's going on, it had plenty of chances to kill us, so obviously we're not going to die immediately. So a certain level of calm, not total calm, but a certain level of calm came over them, and so they were treating it more as a nuisance, right? Well, once they woke up from that extra long sleep, it was past midday and going on a couple hours before evening. As he's up going to restart the fire and make something to eat, there was a little bit of a breeze coming, and he caught this weird smell. He couldn't describe it, just it was pungent. As he's picking up some more kindling from broken branches and stuff just around the campsite, he notices impressions in the ground, and it dawns on him what he's looking at. He's looking at tracks he can't fully make out that have literally circled their whole camp several times. So while they were asleep next to the fire, these things were, from what he surmised from the tracks he was checking out, these things circled several times. At least 2 different size prints circled their camp a couple times while they were sleeping. They heard none of it. Immediately freaked him out. They were re-energized by that. They ended up just staying right by camp, not doing squat, right? He didn't even have a chance but to look at some rocks further up the creek. The whole trip was a wash. Dogs still wouldn't come out of the tent. They basically lived like zombies, half asleep the whole time, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing else ever happened. The experience, as far as any accosting or anything like that all subsided. But they had to sit there with the wonder, waiting for their ride to come. When their ride came, they told their friend everything. Their friend got a ride from a fishing boat captain that laughed at them, and not to mock them, but to tell them, someone should have warned you. We see these things on the beach periodically walking along, and that's where their experience ended. He didn't leave state. He didn't stop going out into the woods. He just went with a different understanding from that point. Him and Carol had been married. They got married the following year. So, man, 45, 46 years, and congrats to them. And thanks for sharing Alexander and Carol. Not their real names, but I told them what names I would use, and they know who they are. And their friend that pointed them out to the channel, I appreciate you guys sharing that experience, because gosh, man, can you just imagine being out there and all of a sudden these events happen to you? It would not be fun. And they held this for many years outside of telling close friends, because when they brought it up, Alexander brought it up to some classmates, just, hey, this is what happened, he was laughed at and mocked. And he didn't understand why, because he felt highly insulted that you know, because he viewed himself as an intelligent guy, working towards his masters on something, and they wanted to treat him like some yahoo. He didn't appreciate that, so he just kind of clammed up, and they only shared that with certain people over the years. And I want to thank them for sharing with us. And thank you guys for joining me. There's merchandise on the website if you're interested. There's the interactive map, of course, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.